Roger's father passed away when he and his sister were young. His mother, convinced of his potential, urged him to become a shaman so the spirits would protect him. She warned that refusing this path would lead to grave misfortune and forced him to study the religious teachings of shamanism, poetry, magic, and mysteries he had never encountered. However, Roger already knew what he wanted from life, and these lessons held no interest for him. He devoted himself entirely to scientific research, and after a decade, he earned his place in society. Then tragedy struck. He was killed by a car. It seemed impossible, yet his mother's warning proved true. Trouble had found him. Even more astonishing was his rebirth. He discovered that life extends beyond a single existence, and everything his mother had said was real. After his death, he understood that some truths can only be learned through experience. Now, reflecting on all of this, he questioned what he was doing. He suddenly slammed his palm down on the textbook pages and announced loudly that the lesson was beginning. Today, they would continue creating a magic circle. Roger now worked as a teacher at the Academy of Magic, and a chain of events had brought him to this moment. Some time earlier, people moved through a train station, some conversing among themselves. Passengers boarded a train carriage, presenting their tickets to the inspector, who wished each of them a safe journey. One passenger approached, and the inspector asked to see his ticket. The man handed it over, and after checking it, the inspector thanked him and wished him well. The man entered the train, and the inspector continued his work. Clenching his hand into a fist, the passenger recalled he had the fourth seat in the fourth car, third compartment. He finally located it and, entering, found Gerard already seated, reading a newspaper. Gerard looked up, surprised to see his neighbor, and greeted him. Roger Selesy nodded in acknowledgement. Soon the train was in motion, traveling onward. After some time reading his book, Roger glanced up at the newspaper Gerard still held. A headline caught his eye. The civil war in the Southern Kingdom had ended, and the princess's faction had won. Roger remarked with a smile that the war had finally concluded. Gerard looked at him warily, narrowing his eyes slightly, then agreed, admitting he too had wondered when it would end. Roger recalled that just recently the prince's faction had been recruiting soldiers, grateful the conflict hadn't dragged on. Suddenly remembering something, Roger apologized to Gerard, realizing he'd forgotten to introduce himself. He gave his name. Gerard responded simply with his first name, noting he had no surname, then assumed Roger was of noble birth. Roger confirmed he was a fallen noble, but asked Gerard not to concern himself with it. Gerard said he understood, and Roger inquired where he was headed. Gerard replied he was going to Lindenbron, the empire's capital, having heard it was a popular tourist destination. Roger smiled, noting the Exilian Empire was famous for its advanced magical engineering, so there was certainly much to see. He himself was traveling to Lissel to join the Theon Academy. Gerard expressed surprise, observing that Roger was quite young and assuming he must be an exceptional specialist. Roger awkwardly closed his eyes and grabbed his hair, insisting he wasn't truly exceptional, just fortunate. Gerard countered that many would envy Roger's position and told him to take pride in himself. Roger smiled gratefully, thanking him for the kind words. Returning to the war topic, Roger asked if Gerard had heard the rumors. He clarified he meant the man from the princess's faction who had been instrumental in the victory. According to some, this person had neither experience in magic nor the highest knightly rank, just a wandering mercenary named Machiavelli. Gerard acknowledged he'd heard this, and Roger sighed, crossing his arms, noting Gerard seemed unsurprised. Gerard admitted he'd assumed it was mere gossip, but it was actually true. Machiavelli had once roamed the world in search of a particular object, and that was the name Roger had used in his past life. Gerard drew Roger's attention, asking if this meant he would be taking over a class at the Theon Academy. Roger confirmed it, specifying he'd be in charge of second-year students. Gerard marveled that Roger was starting directly with second years, observing he was more capable than he'd thought. Suddenly Gerard froze, and noticing his expression, Roger asked in confusion if something was wrong. Looking out the train window, Gerard told him to wait and was about to speak when a massive explosion suddenly rocked the train. Gerard screamed and Roger stammered, asking what was happening. He wondered if the engine had exploded. Gerard exclaimed that couldn't be, the engine was protected by magic. He suddenly winced, frowning, realizing this was a trap. Roger didn't understand why anyone would do this. Gerard assumed someone wanted to rob wealthy merchants or nobles, noting that if they'd caused an explosion, there was definitely a mage among them. He announced seriously that they needed to hide or get off the train. Roger asked him to wait, declaring he would go first. Putting on his hat, he headed for the compartment exit and looked around the carriage, noting the fourth car was empty. Following Roger into the corridor, Gerard frowned, asking if the other passengers were safe. Roger explained the compartments were protected by magic, but Gerard warned this was no guarantee. It was dangerous to remain if the protection used the same spell the bandits had broken. Roger confirmed the explosion had come from the third carriage and wondered why the robbers weren't there yet. Gerard said if he were the robbers, he would have headed to the first carriage. Roger recalled there were first-class passengers there and admitted they were fortunate. Gerard suggested leaving through the back door since they just needed to wait for the border guards. Suddenly, a bandit swung toward the window on a rope, using his momentum to smash through it. Glass shards rained down, and Gerard and Roger screamed, leaping aside. Standing in front of Gerard to shield him, Roger ordered him to stay back. The bandit frowned as he stood up, looking at them. Gerard assessed his condition, saying he looked terrible. Roger frowned, pressing his lips together and eyeing the man warily. The bandit suddenly drew a dagger and charged toward them. Roger waved his hand, forming a sphere of magical energy beside him, and directed the attack at the man. The force sent him screaming and flying to the side. After a brief silence, Gerard asked Roger if he'd killed the man. Roger answered he hadn't, explaining he'd merely immobilized him temporarily. He then moved toward the bandit. Gerard tried to stop him, warning it was dangerous, but Roger insisted everything was fine. He just wanted to ask a few questions. Pointing his cane at the man, Roger demanded to know why he'd entered this carriage. The bandit made no reply, only coughed, then suddenly burst out laughing. Roger declared he hadn't given him permission to laugh and ordered him to answer. The bandit refused to listen, calling Roger vile and shouting he would kill them all. Suddenly, the bandit tore open his shirt, revealing explosives strapped to his chest with a countdown timer. Only 1 second remained. Realizing this, Gerard called out to Roger, telling him to take cover. Roger clenched his jaw, frowning as he stared at the explosives. The next instant, a tremendous explosion erupted, flames bursting from the carriage, sending smoke and sparks flying in all directions. As the flames gradually died down and only smoke remained in the air, Gerard screamed. He'd fallen to the floor, covering his head with his hands, which was why he'd survived the blast. Getting up, he called Roger's attention, asking if he was okay. Suddenly he shuddered, eyes widening as he noticed an empty space ahead. Neither the bandit nor Roger remained, only a gaping hole in the train wall. Gerard walked to the edge of the hole, looked outside, and said Roger's name. He then touched his cheek and winced, noticing part of his skin had peeled away. He frowned in displeasure, sighing as he remembered the suit was custom-made. He tore off his mask, revealing his true form, and asked himself why he was always involved in accidents. There was no specific reason he'd chosen the name Machiavelli. He'd simply taken the name of a famous person from his past life. He'd needed to completely change his identity to avoid dangerous situations while traveling the world, and the Machiavelli persona was supposed to help him do that. It had been a difficult day. Recalling how he'd left the battlefield, he realized he'd attracted unwanted attention, though he should have kept his identity secret. Fortunately, the princess and her soldiers had been triumphant, and he'd managed to slip away when they'd let their guard down and board the train to Lindenbrunn. However, closing his eyes, he asked himself if this was serious. He couldn't understand why something always happened to him. He threw the now unnecessary Gerard mask overboard, then mentally told Roger to rest in peace. Thinking about the ambush in broad daylight, he hadn't expected the bandit to detonate a bomb. Ordinary robbers wouldn't pull off such a thing. He was certain only a psychopath intent on killing everyone could do this, and assumed these people weren't targeting the passengers but the train itself. Suddenly, a train employee rushed into the carriage, caught his attention, and asked if he was all right. Roger didn't answer. The conductor, examining the destruction, asked what had happened. Roger announced the train was under attack by armed robbers, suggesting they were headed for the first carriage and warning the man not to get involved. Looking around, the employee said he needed to evacuate passengers through the last carriage and was about to instruct Roger when Roger suddenly grabbed him by the throat, throwing him to the floor. The man screamed, then stammered, turning to Roger and asking what he was doing. Roger asked with displeasure if the man really thought his pathetic acting would convince him. He pointed out that robbers wouldn't attack any random train, let alone bypass a protective spell that would wear off on its own. This was a sophisticated trick that couldn't be performed without inside help from someone who knew the mechanism. The man stared at Roger with mounting horror, then suddenly frowned and pulled a small dagger from his sleeve. Roger anticipated the action, staying his hand and ordering him not to even think about it. The man cried out in displeasure. Roger remarked they were quite fast and demanded to know who they were and why they were there. When the man didn't answer, Roger asked if he was really going to stay silent. The man didn't argue. Raising him to his feet, Roger ordered him to move forward. Suddenly, Roger paused, turning his head slightly to the side, telling himself to stop paying attention to the sound he'd heard. He guessed what it could be and, crying out, abruptly thrust the man in front of him. The next moment, bullets pierced through the man's body. Roger himself crouched down to avoid being hit. He closed one eye, placing his hand to his head, and wondered when the man had managed to signal. He'd been watching him and realized this was all planned. The man's body fell, and Roger looked at the other bandits who'd burst into the car. One frowned in confusion, asking if there were any survivors. Another marveled that Roger had dodged the gunfire. Standing up, Roger warned them not to even dream of killing him. One bandit ordered his comrades to kill Roger. The men raised their guns, and Roger frowned. But when the bandits pulled the triggers, nothing happened. Bewildered, one lowered his gun, asking why he couldn't shoot. Another exclaimed the machine gun wasn't working. Stuttering, he sharply raised his head, realizing who Roger was. He noticed magical energy glowing above Roger's palm and exclaimed he was a mage. He warned his comrades that Roger had disabled the weapons. Roger turned, noticing streams of magical energy nearby in the air. He clenched his jaw, noting his own magic had dissolved, and wondered if it was a suppressor. Another man admitted he hadn't expected a mage on this train. He ordered Roger to surrender. Roger turned, noticing more bandits approaching from the other side. The mage told him not to move, promising a quick death if he complied. Roger sensed this was no ordinary mage, possibly even fourth rank like himself. However, he didn't recognize the man's face. Thinking about it, Roger noted about 10 minutes had passed since the explosion. It would take a long time to leave the Arete Mountains, so he couldn't just stand there waiting for reinforcements. He realized what he had to do. Roger jumped through the hole in the carriage wall. The mage frowned, asking if he'd really jumped. Getting Hansen's attention, he ordered him to check. The bandit responded, walked to the carriage edge, looked around, and announced he didn't see Roger. He assumed Roger had indeed jumped off the train and noted they could have scared him. Before he could finish, an attack pierced his head. Startled, the mage realized it came from above. He shouted that Roger was on the roof. The bandits began talking in confusion, not understanding how he'd done it. They assumed he'd used flight magic, but were even more amazed, questioning whether it was possible while the train was moving. The mage ordered them to shut up and find Roger. warning the others that Roger was a mage so they couldn't use their full powers against him. He instructed a few people to stay while ordering the rest to head to the first car. The bandits obeyed without question, and several began shooting at the roof. Running and dodging bullets, Roger cried out in displeasure. The mage, understanding the trajectory of his movement, shouted to his men that Roger was heading to the back of the train and told them to follow. When the bandits approached the door to move to another carriage, they didn't even have time to open it. A powerful explosion was heard. Flying to the side, they screamed. Looking at their comrades who hadn't survived the blast, the bandits who were slightly behind asked if this was really a trap. They couldn't understand how Roger had done it so quickly. The mage thought Roger was different from the mages he'd encountered. The efficiency and results of his work were on a completely different level. He noted Roger looked more like a hunter than a mage and even suggested he could be a mercenary. All the bandits suddenly shuddered, hearing a sharp sound. The mage's eyes widened, and he cursed, realizing Roger was separating the carriages to escape. He wondered how he hadn't guessed this before. He understood Roger wasn't going to fight them and rushed to the carriage exit. The next moment, he saw bright light ahead instead of the next carriage. Running out onto the crossing, he noticed the other part of the train moving away. The distance between the carriages gradually increased. The bandits frowned, and the mage cried out in displeasure. Another man cursed, noting they'd missed Roger and shouting they couldn't leave the train to pursue him. The mage vowed he would remember Roger's face, track him down, and kill him. Suddenly he froze, eyes wide open, asking himself what kind of powerful magical energy this was. He didn't understand where it was coming from and turned around. He froze again, seeing Roger standing in the center of the carriage, having created a magic circle in front of himself while frowning in concentration. The mage couldn't understand how Roger was there and wondered if this was another trap. Roger concentrated magical energy in front of the circle, and from this, a powerful beam of magical attack directed toward the bandits, so bright it penetrated even through the train walls. The mage ordered his comrades to run and tried to cover his face with his hand. Some time later, when the magic dissipated, Roger looked around, noticing the dead bandits before him. He thought this was all of them, but suddenly noticed the mage, despite severe damage, still standing. Roger expressed surprise that he'd survived. The mage called Roger names, then asked why he'd done this. He didn't understand why Roger would kill them and questioned if his conscience didn't bother him at all. Roger looked at him thoughtfully. The mage declared the people Roger killed were ordinary patriots fighting for peace. Roger noted the man was crazier than expected. The mage demanded an answer. Roger asked if they weren't the ones who tried to kill him first. He asked with displeasure if the man dared to accuse him now. He told him to explain this to everyone who was no longer breathing and reminded him it was he who'd said he would find Roger and take his life. Roger declared the man was pathetic and honestly admitted he could have let him go. But the problem was the man now knew his face. If he was going to pursue him, it was better to settle it here and now. The man wanted to say something else, but the next moment, an ice blade suddenly passed through his body. Even Roger froze in bewilderment, then noticed Veronica DeVille entering the carriage through a hole in the wall. Roger looked at the remains of the mage's body that fell to the floor. Veronica asked if he was okay. Roger looked at her. She assumed he was scared, but advised him not to worry since the Knights of Cold Steel were already there. The other bandits began cursing, shocked the knights were already present. They started shooting, amazed the knights used flight magic in such weather. However, one knight raised a magic shield, and the bullets didn't harm him. At the same time, he created a magical attack, holding it close to his palm, and ran closer to the men. One flinched, screaming in fear. Using the boost from the attack, the knight struck, then turned sharply toward another bandit, who also screamed in fear before crying out in pain. Having finished with the bandit, the knight addressed his comrades, announcing the second car was cleared. Another knight declared the first car was clear and the passengers were safe. Another knight turned to Veronica, asking permission to report that the situation on the train was completely under control. She exclaimed this was wonderful work and ordered them to ensure the passengers reached the next station safely. Some time later, the train arrived at the leather station. A crowd gathered on the platform, talking among themselves. Roger still sat on the train, looking out the window. Suddenly, Veronica entered the compartment and asked how he was feeling. She wondered if he'd been injured by the terrorists. Looking at her, Roger declared he was fine thanks to the Knights of Cold Steel and explained he was simply lost in thought. Veronica admitted she was glad to hear this and smiled, suggesting she should have introduced herself right away. Placing her palm on her chest, she gave her name. Bowing his head slightly, Roger was about to respond when someone suddenly apologized, drawing their attention. Veronica turned, noticing a person approaching, and asked if he wanted something. Extending his palm toward her, he asked if she was the commander of the Knights of White Steel. She confirmed this, saying she was Lieutenant Veronica. Ramaz, showing his ID, announced he was an officer of the Leather Valk Police Department and stated his name. He explained he was aware of the attack on the train in the Arret Mountains. Veronica said they'd eliminated all the criminals. Ramaz thanked her for her hard work, but noted there was something odd about the report. Roger winced, paying attention to their conversation. Veronica asked, not understanding what Ramaz meant. He thoughtfully placed his hand on his chin, saying the attackers had taken over the train too quickly. Even with magical power, they couldn't have broken through the defenses so easily. Veronica flinched in surprise. Ramaz suggested there was someone on board the train who'd helped these people. Thoughtfully placing her hand on her chin, Veronica admitted it was a reasonable idea. Ramaz added it was only a guess, explaining they wouldn't detain people but simply establish their identities. Veronica agreed, noting she understood. Looking at Roger, she asked if he'd heard. He nodded. She warned that the main thing was to answer honestly, and in that case, everything would be fine. Roger maintained a neutral expression, but he thought he was in serious trouble. There was nothing suspicious about Gerard's identity. He'd passed ticket control as expected and legally boarded the train. But the problem was his face. Gerard's mask was damaged. He certainly couldn't pass for 45. He understood that if he was under investigation, sooner or later someone would reveal his secret, and he'd be hanged or, if lucky, subjected to severe torture. There were many police officers and knights on the street, making escape impossible. He looked through the window at the street, noticing police officers. Besides, Veronica was merciless to criminals. She was smiling and talking to him now, but he knew as soon as they suspected him, she would use her magic to cut him in two. Someone drew his attention, asking if he was okay. Roger looked at Ramaz, who apologized, explaining he needed time to get the passenger list. He noted Roger had nothing to worry about and asked him to simply confirm his identity. He also requested the ticket if Roger still had it. Roger held it out. The train employee, looking at the ticket, announced this was seat 430. Thoughtfully repeating the seat number, Ramaz looked at the documents in his hands and read that Roger, 25 years old, and Gerard, a man just over 40, had occupied this seat. Raising his head, Ramaz asked where the second passenger was. Roger replied he'd been caught in an explosion during the attack. He said it happened when they were passing the Arret Mountains and he'd fallen off a cliff. Ramaz narrowed his eyes thoughtfully and looked closely at Roger, then asked him to stay put. Veronica said he couldn't be a suspect. Ramaz questioned this. She told him that when they'd arrived, Roger had been fighting terrorists and asked if a traitor would behave like that. Ramaz asked if Roger had really fought robbers. He cried out in surprise, then realized what had happened. Thoughtfully holding his chin with his hand, he apologized to Roger, addressing him by name. Roger didn't show his surprise outwardly, but in his mind, he cried out in bewilderment. Ramaz suddenly noticed Roger had been accepted to work at the Theon Academy and asked in confusion. Veronica also asked if this was true. They looked at Roger. Finally smiling, he confirmed it. Standing up and taking his suitcase, he put his hat on his head and announced he was the new professor. When they left the station, Ramez once again apologized to Roger for the inconvenience. Roger said there was no need to apologize since he'd been able to get there thanks to them. Ramaz said he would take him to the academy, but Roger insisted he wasn't obliged to do this. Ramaz exclaimed the future of their empire was in Roger's hands and asked how he could not see him off. Roger wasn't going to agree, understanding it would be better if they both left him alone. In the end, he announced he had things to do so he couldn't delay them any longer. If Roger insisted, Ramaz wouldn't argue anymore. Roger turned, saying in that case he would go. Turning to Veronica, he admitted their acquaintance was short-lived, but noted he was glad to have met her. She exclaimed this was mutual and added they might meet again. Without answering, Roger began to leave and thought he'd actually done it. Mentally addressing the real Roger, he apologized and thanked him for saving his life. He was glad the photo quality left much to be desired. It was difficult to distinguish him from the real Roger in the picture. Now that the problem was solved, he was fine. He decided he needed to hide and create a new identity. Suddenly, he froze, hearing someone call Roger's name. Turning around, he saw a man who announced he recognized him, adding he'd seen him conversing with the knight. Bowing, Wilford announced he worked at the Theon Academy. Having heard what had happened, he'd come to meet Roger. He was glad Roger was unharmed and asked him to get in, saying he would take him to Theon. Roger became more troubled but still got into the carriage. After a while, Wilford began moving forward, driving the mechanical horse. Roger leaned slightly, resting his chin on his intertwined hands, thinking this was bad. The academy had sent someone who was no ordinary worker to meet him. He noticed Wilford had a fit body, and moreover, he hadn't noticed how Wilford had appeared beside him, meaning he was most likely a knight. He knew if he ran away using a foolish excuse, it would seem suspicious, and Wilford would follow him. He supposed it would be better to postpone his escape. Since Gerard was presumed dead, he was nothing more than a ghost in this country. This meant if he disappeared, no one would notice. He was glad he now had an iron alibi, and until then, he could live the life of Roger. Some time later, Wilford warned they'd arrived and said this was Theon. They entered the academy grounds. Shocked, Roger asked himself if all this really belonged to the academy. The property was larger than he'd imagined. Stopping the carriage, Wilford waited for Roger to exit and said he would take him to the rector, adding Roger could trust him with the luggage. They walked closer to the academy building itself. Entering inside, Wilford led Roger to the right door. Entering the office, Roger gave his name and announced he'd arrived on behalf of Rector Eliza Willow. Sitting before him at the table, Eliza smiled, then said she'd been waiting for him. Stating her name, she announced she was the director of Theon Academy. She also asked if Roger was okay, explaining she'd heard about the terrorist attack. He replied everything was fine since the knightly order had come to their aid in time. Eliza smiled happily, closing her eyes and clasping her palms together. She admitted she was glad to hear that, since if Roger had suffered, it would have affected them too. He didn't understand how she could speak so openly about the possible negative consequences for them and noted it simply didn't fit in his head. However, what bothered him more was the strange feeling that arose as soon as he'd entered the room. He supposed it could have been his imagination and wondered with interest if Eliza had met Roger before. Looking at her smile, he wondered if she'd seen through him. Eventually, Eliza began speaking again, noting they'd met in person. Exclaiming he was very tall and handsome, Roger, hearing this remark, assumed she hadn't seen through him. He thanked Eliza aloud for the compliment, even if she was being polite. She announced she was sure he would be popular with the students. Rising from her seat, she handed him a document, asking him to take it. She decided to repeat the information Roger had received earlier, explaining it stated the salary and that the employment contract was for 2 years. She noted food and accommodation would be paid for by the academy. Roger read the document, asking himself if this was really a contract. He noted it didn't matter much if he was going to run away soon anyway. Suddenly, he froze in shock, wondering if the salary was really 30 imperial gold coins per month. If converted into the national currency, that was 30 million dinar, a whopping 300 million in 1 year. Watching him, Eliza asked how he felt about the contract. She assumed the conditions were excellent and asked if that was true. Roger agreed the conditions weren't bad. He thought about how to put it and eventually concluded it was just insane what a jackpot. However, he ordered himself to calm down, assuming with such a salary and responsibilities, professors at Theon had considerable duties. He didn't know if he'd be able to hide his lack of knowledge teaching at Theon Academy, where everyone was a genius. However, his employment here was already a done deal. He knew it would be suspicious if he suddenly refused. This meant he had no choice but to agree. He noted he was skilled at lying, bluffing, and reading the mood of his interlocutor. Finally, he announced aloud he was quite satisfied with everything and indicated he was ready to sign the contract. He thought he also had the experience and knowledge of his present and past life, so he was confident he could play the role of a professor. Extending her hand toward him, Eliza said this was wonderful and admitted she would be glad to work with him. Shaking her hand, Roger replied the feeling was mutual and thought he would only have to pretend for 2 years. In his mind, he exclaimed he would survive these 2 years, and after that, he'd be free. Soon it was night. Sitting in the room, Roger thought he had 3 weeks before the semester began. He assumed this time should be enough to prepare. He didn't think they'd give him an entire house. Sighing, he closed his eyes, asking if this really meant he would be a professor at the academy this time. After being brought to this world 27 years ago, he'd been reincarnated with all his memories but lost his abilities. He couldn't rely on his parents, only on himself, and he'd had to endure many difficult experiences, but he'd never thought he would become a professor. Technically, he'd been given a fictitious job, or more accurately, given it without his own desire. However, he needed a new identity, and Roger's situation played into his hands. Roger was from a fallen noble family, originally from the small kingdom of Kedon. He was also an only child whose parents had passed away. The style of the letters Roger left was quite formal, meaning Roger had no relatives, so no one should discover him. He was certain there was no better disguise. Standing up, he decided he needed to sort out the lectures and find information about the academy. In the end, the first thing he decided was to explore the area. He froze, feeling an unpleasant sensation in his stomach, realizing he hadn't eaten at all. In the end, he decided to put everything off until the next day and asked himself where the restaurant was. Some time later, sitting at a table, Roger read the documents in his hands. Taking a sip from his cup, he asked himself if it had really been 2 weeks already. It had passed very quickly, but overall he'd managed to collect the necessary information and prepare for the classes. In the remaining week, he needed to learn how to apply his new knowledge in practice. Noticing a man sitting at the next table, he thought visitors were already arriving, so he decided he would go home and prepare for the introductory course. Suddenly, Sedina Rakan, sitting with her back to him, said she was glad he was safe. She looked straight ahead without turning toward Roger and admitted she'd been worried something could happen to him. He froze, eyes widened, and remained silent for a while. Then Sedina, still not receiving an answer, asked why he hadn't contacted them for 2 whole weeks. She announced the rest of the organization was also worried about him and called him first order. Roger took another sip from his cup and still didn't answer. Then, putting the cup down, he finally announced he'd had to check something. He noted if he understood correctly, he was being followed. To be more precise, Roger was. Lowering her head, Sedina said the terrorist attack was a surprise, adding they didn't know the rebels were planning an attack. Roger explained he'd needed information about the academy. Startled, Sedina asked in shock, then questioned if they really hadn't sent this. He announced he'd had to make sure the information was true. The girl cried out, understanding everything. Roger cursed, wondering what was going on. Now he had to try not to arouse any suspicions. He asked Sedina if they'd taken care of everything. She answered they had, explaining that before meeting with Roger, they'd dealt with the main figures of the academy they were targeting and had also tracked down and eliminated the traitors to the organization. As far as she knew, the traitors had been fed their own limbs, and the remains had been thrown to the dogs. She smiled, asking if that wasn't a fitting punishment. Roger thought this was very bad and decided the first thing he should do was calm down. Sedina suddenly winced, apologizing, realizing she should have personally verified this before reporting to Roger. He didn't understand what she was talking about at all and answered aloud it didn't matter. He then asked her to tell him the reason for her sudden appearance. She explained he'd been in this place for a month already, but still hadn't contacted them. Roger asked if that was why she'd decided to take matters into her own hands. Sedina cried out, apologizing to him. He ordered her to remain silent, abruptly putting down his cup, adding she was also attracting unnecessary attention with her appearance. He admitted she was getting on his nerves and asked if she really wanted them to be noticed. He also noted she was reacting sharply to his words, so he was certain she was afraid of him. Sedina placed her trembling palms on her knees. Roger, placing his palm to his face, announced he was now listening to her report. He asked how many people they'd placed. She replied 31 people from the Third Order and 7 from the Second Order had been successfully infiltrated. The other members of the First Order had already taken their positions according to plan. Roger replied this was good, declaring everything was proceeding as it should. He said if the report was finished, they would part ways. She agreed, asking that next time Roger come to the pre-arranged place. He asked with displeasure if she was really telling him what to do. She froze, eyes widening. Roger, turning in her direction, asked how she dared give him orders. A little later, looking at the letters he'd found, Roger said Roger was a fallen nobleman with no family, the youngest mage of the 4th rank, and also a Theon professor. He sat on the edge of the bed, bowed his head, and clenching his jaw in irritation, frowned. He cursed, asking himself why he hadn't sensed something was wrong before. Roger's identity seemed perfect. It was specially created to avoid suspicion. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been able to infiltrate the academy. All the letters Roger found were most likely encoded. Sighing, he cursed again, placing his hands to his head. Then, looking at the decorated ceiling, he lay down on the bed. Closing his eyes, he admitted he'd miscalculated. He couldn't believe he'd gotten himself into such a mess with his hasty actions. Looking over the letters again, he sat down at the table, assuming Roger had used the Codan language to encode the message. The sentence construction had seemed strange immediately, but he hadn't thought the matter was with the First Order, whose task was to infiltrate the academy, gain everyone's trust, then periodically report on the progress. However, this wasn't the only thing worrying him. Closing his eyes, he mentally noted the more he thought about it, the less he believed it. He didn't understand how the head of a secret society could die in a terrorist attack. He mentally exclaimed Roger was one of the strongest members of the organization sent to spy on the academy. He was certain such a person should have survived. Sighing, he finally decided there was no point condemning the dead. It turned out this whole story between Theon Academy and the secret organization was added to his secrets. Roger assumed it might even be good the organization members had contacted him. After all, judging by what the girl had said, the secret society consisted of 4 orders: the Zero Order, First Order, Second Order, and Third Order. Even though Roger didn't know anything about the Zero Order, he at least knew of its existence. He also decided he needed to find out who else the First Order had sent. If this person was familiar with Roger, there was a risk he'd be exposed. The main thing now was not to get caught. The best option for him would be to eliminate the secret orders using Theon. A secret organization couldn't stand up to a powerful academy, no matter how strong it was. He decided he had to obtain the information he needed without either side knowing. Sighing, he thought this game on two fronts was making his head split. Closing his eyes, he assumed he had 2 difficult years ahead of him. Some time later at the academy, students walked along the corridors, talking to each other. Some gathered in the auditorium, taking their seats. One student, catching his comrade's attention, asked if they'd heard the news yet. He announced a new professor would be teaching spell theory and visual representation of the elements. Someone asked if this was really a new professor for the second years. The person assumed the professor knew his business. One student added the management had no other choice since the former professor had suddenly resigned. Flora Lumos, listening to the students' conversations, suddenly turned around sharply as one asked what else the professor could do when a student had embarrassed him in front of everyone by demonstrating she was capable of it. Cheryl, coming closer to Flora, assumed these people were talking about her. Closing her eyes, Flora asked what she'd done. She explained she'd simply shown the professor his magical techniques left much to be desired. Cheryl, closing her eyes, bowed her head in agreement and wanted to object but ultimately said nothing. One student had heard the new professor had a brilliant reputation, having written numerous reports while being a military officer. Another guy assumed this man was a respected person, not some simpleton. Another guy exclaimed, asking if the others knew anything else. He declared this professor was a fallen trustee. In that case, the students understood they couldn't worry about grades. Flora tilted her head to the side, thinking it was silly to have already come to their conclusions. At that moment, Roger walked through the classroom door and up the small stairs to where he was supposed to stand. He slammed his palm on the table, drawing the students' attention, and announced he was their new professor, introducing himself as Roger. He added it was a pleasure to meet them. Looking seriously at the frozen students watching him in shock, he noted they didn't have a schedule as such yet, so he decided to make a few announcements before they started the main course. He said he would be teaching them spells, but the structure of the lessons would be unusual for them. He explained they would be studying not only theory but also developing practical skills. He added classes wouldn't be held exclusively for second years. First years would also be able to attend. The students began muttering at this. Roger asked them to remain silent, holding his palm out. Admitting he understood they weren't happy with this arrangement, he asked them not to worry, warning the workload would remain the same. One student suddenly raised his hand, asking if they could know the reason Roger decided to combine the courses. Endo Van Exilian looked at Roger carefully, waiting for him to answer. Roger thought he'd seen her somewhere before and announced aloud he considered it his duty as a teacher to allow everyone to gain something useful from the classes, regardless of their level. In addition, he warned the students not to expect standard lessons. Alenda admitted she didn't understand, asking him to explain further. However, Roger said it would be boring if he revealed all his cards so quickly. Alenda lowered her head. Roger announced if he was of interest to them, they would see each other at the next class. There was also something else he wanted to point out. This would be the last one. He warned that if any students thought they'd be able to earn good grades without straining themselves just because he was a new professor, he might disappoint them. He frowned seriously, looking at the frightened students. Mentally, he asked them not to come to his class. Although he'd prepared well, he still understood it would be easier for him to teach as few students as possible. He noted the pride of the second years would be hurt if they allowed themselves to attend classes equally with the first years. Besides, he didn't understand who would want to study with him if it was difficult. He said aloud this was all for now and asked if there were any questions. The students remained silent, looking at him. They noticed Roger was pressing with his energy, assuming his work as an officer had affected him. According to rumors, he was the youngest mage of the 4th rank, and many wondered if this was true. The students had many questions but couldn't muster the courage to ask even one. Flora, thinking, smiled and placed her hand to her chin. Roger finally announced if there were no questions, he would declare the beginning of the semester open. After a while, he walked out into the hallway, closing his eyes and smiling contentedly. He thought the students had no questions at all, though he'd assumed they'd at least want to clarify something or find out about him. He decided this was better for him. Although the answers he'd prepared in advance weren't needed, suddenly he became much less pleased. Telling himself to wait, he frowned, wondering if the students had kept silent on purpose. He supposed he should have been more friendly and thought he might have hurt these students' pride. Placing his hand to his chin, he stood still for a while, then suddenly opened his eyes, shuddering slightly. He noticed students had begun moving out of his way, looking at him calmly. They'd cleared a path for him in the hallway. Roger wondered if this was true. He thought he was just assuming it, but was distracted from his thoughts as someone caught his attention and said hello. Turning around, Roger noticed Selena, who asked if he was their new professor. She stated her name and exclaimed it was nice to meet him, announcing she was also working there for the first day. Roger realized how things really were and replied the feeling was mutual, asking if Selena wanted to ask him something. She replied she did and asked if he'd eaten lunch yet. Soon outside the academy, someone admitted it was nice to meet him. It was Bro, who explained he was teaching the students how to summon golems. Matilda, standing next to him, also introduced herself, explaining she was in charge of charms and hallucinations from the curse and dispelling magic section. Roger, standing next to them, admitted he was glad to meet them. He gave his name, explaining he taught the theory and practice of spells. He wondered if this was a meeting for new professors to get to know each other better. They noted he was still attractive up close, and he thanked them for that. A little further away, Chris Benamor looked at Roger with displeasure. Roger shuddered, noticing his attention, and looked in his direction. But Chris turned away. Matilda, coming closer to Roger, quietly said this was Professor Chris, who was the first of them to join the academy. She noted, as far as Roger could see, he was a nobleman not like them commoners. Roger replied everything was clear to him. He thought that if you didn't count him among the new professors, there was one nobleman and 3 people of common origin. Despite their different statuses, they were the best in their fields. In other words, there was a high probability another member of the First Order was among them. Thoughtfully holding his chin with his hand, Roger closed his eyes, thinking the fact Chris was the first to join the academy didn't mean anything. Besides, one couldn't take his colleague's word for it. Chris, sighing with displeasure, announced he could no longer be there. He admitted he'd been interested in looking at the new teachers, but they were all some kind of commoners and a fallen nobleman. He warned that if anything, he wasn't with them, they were on their own, and he was on his own. He paid special attention to Roger, ordering him not to pretend to be an important person. Matilda frowned with displeasure, exclaiming Chris's status didn't give him the right to look down on them. She asked Roger not to pay attention to Chris. He replied everything was fine. If Chris was against their company, he offered to go without him. Sedina and Bro agreed, thinking it sounded good. As he followed them to the right place, Roger thought he should now be glad he had company at dinner. As night fell, students used a special panel to talk among themselves. One asked if the others had heard about the new professor named Roger. Some said he was the youngest mage of the 4th rank, had also worked as a military officer, and had participated in the hunt for cryptids. In addition, he was listed in the Wizard Tower as an independent specialist in magic. Someone asked if the others thought this was true. Sedina, also typing on the panel, thought she couldn't allow Roger's first lesson to fail, so she decided to ensure as many students as possible came to him. Other students, seeing the messages, began asking in shock if freshmen could come too. They thought about it, realizing it sounded tempting, and suggested they could try. A little later, Roger walked down the academy hallway, thinking today was his first lecture. He wondered how many students decided to stay, since he'd specifically warned them his classes would be difficult. He was certain most people definitely wouldn't come, and if they did, it would only be because the other classes would be packed. He assumed at best about 30 people would stay, no more. He walked to the auditorium. The students, who'd been talking about the post they were reading, were distracted, paying attention to Roger. Noticing the number of people in the audience, he asked himself in shock why there were so many students. He was amazed all 80 seats were occupied. Looking at the students, he asked himself why there were more freshmen than sophomores. The students noticed the atmosphere changed greatly when Roger entered and assumed he was indeed a military officer. Roger, meanwhile, wondered if it was really scary for first years to attend classes with second years. He assumed he'd been set up and frowned in displeasure. Eventually, he dismissed these thoughts, assuming he'd simply underestimated the students. Approaching the table, he placed his hand to his face, thinking Fion Academy was attended by the best of the best from all over the continent. He assumed he'd awakened their competitive spirit. Finally, removing his hand from his face, he realized he had no choice. He said he saw new faces, so he decided he should introduce himself. He stated his name, warning he would teach the students everything about spells. He decided he would give it his all. One boy, raising his hand, announced he had a question. He asked if Roger meant all 4 training profiles when he said he would teach them everything. Roger looked at him with displeasure, warning he hadn't yet allowed questions. However, he decided today he would be lenient. The boy lowered his hand in fear. Roger said from this day on, those who disrupted the course of the lesson or questioned his authority would have points deducted. But they'd have the opportunity to regain them, so he warned them not to relax. However, since the question was already asked, he decided to answer it. He confirmed he would teach the students all training profiles. These profiles were release, elemental magic, telekinesis, and strengthening. That's what they were called. One student noted usually they taught a maximum of 2 of these, but Roger aimed for 4 at once. Flora, with her hand on her chin, suggested Roger was setting the bar too high. Roger decided today he would show something that would stir up the students' interest. Putting his wand forward, he concentrated magical energy next to it, explaining this was a 3rd-level spell called Trembling Flame. It was created based on release using heat, ignition, compression, expansion, dispersion, and acceleration. It was a technique of synergy involving 7 components, and it was 3 times faster than modern methods of performing this spell. He smiled slightly, looking at the students. They began talking among themselves, asking if Roger was really going to speed up the spell creation process. They didn't know if it was possible, and noted it was somehow unconvincing. Cheryl, looking at Flora, asked how she thought was Roger telling the truth. Flora admitted she wasn't sure because she didn't think it was possible, since Roger had changed the basic structure of the spell. She thought there were scrolls to store spells as well as memory reverberation, but both methods had their limits. She thought if Roger used one of these methods, she would be very disappointed in him. Roger, leaving the spell floating in the air next to him, assumed the students had many questions and decided he would answer some. Alex, a silent second year, raised his hand and asked how this technique could be 3 times faster than the techniques they knew. Roger explained it reduced the time it took to cast the spell and said the next person could speak. Dahlia, a first year, also raised her hand and asked if this meant Roger had changed the structure of an existing spell. He replied it wasn't so. If you rework a ready-made technique, it becomes a completely different spell. He announced he would teach the students to speed up spell creation processes while keeping the technique in its original form. Another student raised his hand, catching Roger's attention. It was Flora, who declared this was impossible. Looking at her, Roger froze for a while without answering. Flora introduced herself again, declaring it was impossible. While Roger remained silent, looking at her seriously, the students noticed it was Flora's turn and warned Roger to be more careful. Roger announced he didn't allow anything to be explained, only told them to ask questions. However, he decided he would listen to Flora and asked why she was sure it was impossible. She said that in order to speed up the process of casting a spell using familiar techniques, one must constantly practice and be a master of it. She asked if Roger was really saying he could do something even geniuses couldn't do. Personally, she didn't believe him. He placed his hand to his chin and asked what if he said geniuses could learn it, but they just didn't try. Flora questioned this. Roger declared magic had stopped developing because it was focused on history and customs. At the same time, science was constantly advancing and now threatening to overtake magic. He wasn't trying to say science was a step above, he just meant magic had room to improve. That was why Flora's statement was wrong. If no one was trying to improve it, then he was going to be the first. She frowned, asking if he really thought she didn't understand what was happening. She noticed Roger was so proud of himself he'd lost all shame. Pointing to the spell, Roger declared it was difficult to explain in words alone, so he asked Flora for permission to demonstrate. After clarifying her name, he asked if she knew how long it took on average to create a trembling flame. She answered it depended on ability. A mage who'd barely crossed the 3rd rank would do it in 10 seconds, and a mage of higher rank in 5 seconds. This was indeed true. Roger believed it wasn't necessary to start from rank and offered to take them his students as the starting point. Flora said in this case it would take at least 5 seconds, though she could do it faster. Her confidence impressed Roger. He asked if she could go to the board and show everyone an example. Rising, Flora agreed. Descending, she stretched out her hand forward, creating a spell. The magical energy swirled and soon formed into the desired spell. The students were amazed, saying how fast it was. They realized it was obvious she was the daughter of the Lumos family. Looking at his watch, Roger noticed the spell took 4 seconds and 78 milliseconds. Admitting he found it hard to believe Flora was a second-year student, he said it was flawless execution. Flora replied it was nothing special. Roger suddenly said it was still too slow. Flora questioned this. He announced the best time for a 3rd-tier mage was 4.41 seconds, so Flora's time was a little short. She announced she would speed up if she practiced. Roger suddenly said 4.41 was still not fast enough. The students were amazed, asking if he was serious. They wondered how fast Roger was in that case. He stretched out his hand and told them to watch how to create a flickering flame. A beam of magical energy shot forward. Watching Roger's actions, Flora asked what he was doing. She thought it was another technique. The next moment, the desired magic circle was already formed in front of Roger. Flora, as well as the other students, froze in shock, asking what that was. The spell took 1 second, but they noticed even less time had passed. Flora thought this wasn't the trembling flame technique, noticing Roger had completely changed the structure of it. Roger asked if everyone saw it. He decided to repeat the spell for those who didn't notice and again created it. The students froze again, watching him in shock. Roger noticed they'd now changed their minds and announced it took him 0.24 seconds to create the trembling flame. This was much faster than the official record. The spell may have seemed strange because the first time he'd used a different technique, but the spell was still the same. In other words, he was using one technique to create another technique. One student repeated his words in confusion. Another asked what that meant. Roger said they were changing the initial data and arriving at a known result, creating a kind of program. As if the body of the magician were equipment and the accumulation of magical power were data. In this case, the programs called techniques would activate the software that is magic. This is what he called the source code. Repeating this name in her mind, Flora thought she'd never heard of such magic. She wondered who Roger was. Drawing her attention to himself, Roger asked if he'd now dispelled her doubts. She looked down but confirmed this was indeed the case. Roger reminded her she'd interrupted the course of the lesson without his permission, all because she was biased about his words. He asked if she agreed with him. Flora lowered her head in agreement. Roger warned her seriously she'd acted unreasonably and rudely toward him, so he warned her she would have -10 points. Flora stood there without answering. The students didn't understand how this could be. Shocked Roger had penalized Flora. Cheryl looked at her excitedly, saying her name. Flora clenched her jaw, then turned around, getting ready to go to her seat. Roger suddenly began speaking again, saying she'd shown the perfect technique for creating a trembling flame. Flora froze. He returned her 10 points and warned he respected diligent students, praising Flora. Clenching her hand into a fist, she thanked him for the praise. One student asked if the penalty points were really cancelled. Another girl admitted she was very happy. One boy sighed in displeasure. When Flora returned to her seat, Cheryl asked how she was feeling. She declared everything was fine and thanked her for her concern. Cheryl smiled in agreement and thought Flora had quickly dismissed the situation. Noting it couldn't be otherwise after all, it was Flora. She looked away a little, and Flora frowned in displeasure. Roger, taking off his coat, hung it on the coat rack. Warning this was only an introduction, now he decided to begin the lesson. He also warned he would select students who listened carefully and teach them the opening move, so he told them to work hard. Some students looked at him enthusiastically, some more fearfully. Roger began his lecture. Aiden thought he'd heard the other students talking nonsense about Roger and that he'd been afraid he'd come in vain. But he was wrong. Now he smiled in admiration, understanding why Theon was the strongest academy. Sometime later, Roger announced their class was over. Turning to leave, he said the students could go free and asked them to review the material at home. As he left, Aiden exclaimed Roger was incredible. He couldn't even believe he'd seen something similar to the source code. Jen Fio sighed dismissively, asking if such nonsense really impressed the other students. He declared it only showed how narrow-minded they were and said this was why commoners didn't belong here. Aiden looked at him in bewilderment, then turned his head toward the rest of the students, who turned away, doing their own thing. Awkwardly scratching the back of his head with his palm, he asked if Jen was really talking to him. He apologized. Jen asked irritably if he was making fun of him. Aiden exclaimed he absolutely wasn't doing that. Jen was already angry, asking how he dared look down on the eldest son of Baron Fio. Aiden reminded him he was saying he didn't want this. Someone else suddenly said the name of Baron Fio and asked if his estate was on the far border of the empire. It was Leo, who, descending from the top of the auditorium, looked seriously at Jen. Aiden grinned. Jen asked if Theon was now accepting children too. Leo Singh said it was better this way than accepting the stupid sons of the baronial family. Jen gritted his teeth in irritation, frowning as he pulled out his wand. Calling Aiden and Leo names, he ordered them to listen and asked how they dared insult a noble. He promised they would answer for their words. Leo didn't look scared by his threat and simply suggested he try it. Jen flinched, asking in confusion. Leo, going even lower, repeated he told him to try it. He suggested Jen see what would happen if he attacked right there. He doubted the Academy would turn a blind eye to this just because of Jen's status and asked if he hadn't bothered to read the rules before joining. He warned him to look around better before raising his voice and asked if Jen had noticed they had observers. Jen turned around, indeed seeing students talking among themselves, watching them. He repeated Leo's words about watching his back and frowned indignantly. When he left, Aiden sighed and thanked Leo for his help, then told him his name. Leo introduced himself in return, warning Aiden not to thank him. He was simply pissed off by Jen bragging about his status. Aiden exclaimed Leo was a very nice guy. Leo asked if he'd heard what he said. In the end, he decided to go. Aiden exclaimed he would go with him. Leo, closing his eyes, noted he didn't even know where he was going. Aiden asked if it was true Leo was holding alchemy textbooks. He explained he was also going to an alchemy class. Leo sighed after looking at him, but eventually told him to do as he wanted. He also warned Aiden not to be so obvious. Aiden asked confusedly what he was talking about. Leo explained he was talking about Aiden being a country bumpkin and a commoner who couldn't study magic properly. Aiden asked if it was really that obvious he didn't even know that. Leo warned him he needed to know how things worked in Theon, especially with the second years, who had some of the most social standing. First was Flora, a second-year student. Aiden asked if Leo was talking about the girl who'd spoken in front of the class today. He confirmed it, noting he'd heard Flora was no picnic. So he warned Aiden not to go near her. The previous professor of spell theory and practice had quit because of her. Second was a noble woman from the Exilian Empire, the third princess of Elendil. He added that commoners like them would get into trouble if they offended royalty. Aiden knew who he meant, noting he'd seen Elendil in the lecture. Thirdly, there was another student who led the most famous company of the second year, consisting of nobles. That was Fried van Walberg. Noticing the name Fried, Aiden remembered the Walberg were one of the 3 most noble dual families. Leo confirmed this, noting to them they were just gnats, so they should stay away from the Frieden. Fortunately, he didn't attend that class. In addition, Leo remembered Theo was one of their company. Sighing, Aiden noted he'd already managed to irritate him. However, he decided nothing could be done about it and asked if there was anyone else. Leo couldn't tell if he was being brave or stupid, but eventually told him there were a few more students he'd tell them about on the way. Happy about this, Aiden asked if Leo wanted to have lunch together. Leo questioned why he would want to. During this time, one of the students was watching them closely. Soon Roger walked down the academy hallway, thinking about what had happened. He noted the students' reactions were better than he'd imagined. He hadn't even expected this. The time in this world corresponded to the 19th century on Earth, and even accounting for the presence of magical power. Science here hadn't advanced as well as it had in the 21st century in Roger's world. That's why he'd created the source code by combining magic and science. He really hadn't thought it would surprise the students so much. When his teacher saw this development, he'd simply said it wasn't bad. Noting his teacher was brief, Roger noted this was why he'd expected something like this from the students. The process of creating a spell had to be fast and precise, but it was difficult and limited to the 3rd tier. He couldn't teach the students only the source code and decided he needed to prepare more spells in order not to be discovered. He walked up to a door and asked himself if this was really his office. Opening the door, he walked inside. Eliza, who was in the office, sighed remotely, turning around in his direction. She smiled, telling him to come in, and asked how he liked the office. She assumed it had beautiful interior. Roger didn't answer but simply looked at her in surprise. Some time later, Eliza told him each professor in the academy was allocated a personal space. She added Roger could use this space at his own discretion. He sat opposite her on the sofa, realizing how things really were, and asked what brought Eliza there. She asked if she couldn't be there. Closing his eyes, he explained he was simply curious about the reason for her visit, honestly admitting she'd confused him with her appearance. Closing her eyes, Eliza smiled, explaining she simply wanted to check on their dear professor. She also drew attention to the fact Roger was very frank. She added she was obliged to keep an eye on them, being the rector, and looked closely at Roger. Lowering his head, he thought, noticing he felt a tingling in his body when their eyes met. Crossing her arms over her chest, a little displeased, Eliza said Roger was very calm. She admitted she'd thought he would be surprised. He apologized but declared his portion of surprises for today was full. He thought stumbling upon the rector at night wouldn't be so unexpected and wondered what Eliza was doing in his office. She added that for the other professors, her appearance was unexpected, noting Roger was the last one she'd visited. He realized she'd visited not only him and wondered why she'd saved him for last. He assumed she knew something and thought that no matter how well the organization was hidden, suspicious details wouldn't go unnoticed by the Academy's rector. He assumed Eliza suspected him of something but thought it was unfair, although he'd led a secret organization. He didn't work for them. Finally, distracting him from his thoughts, Eliza noted she'd heard Roger invited first years to his lectures. He confirmed this, explaining he didn't separate the students into classes. Eliza warned she wasn't blaming him for anything. Admitting she actually agreed with his teaching methods, there were some really strong students among the new students. There were also students who used unique magic. Roger asked if that was true. He explained his surprise by saying he'd just received the class list. Eliza noted in any case, a princess was attending his classes, so she asked him to try not to get into trouble. She didn't ask him to treat her specially, but simply explained it would be difficult to resolve the situation if something bad happened. Roger was surprised to hear about the princess. Eliza added she had high hopes for him and smiled. Standing up, she congratulated him on successfully conducting the first class. That was why she wouldn't worry anymore, since the students had had a good impression of Roger. He offered her some tea. She thanked him for it, acknowledging she would appreciate his hospitality, but said she had business to attend to. She left the office, wishing Roger good luck with his work. Closing the door behind her, she paused for a moment. Wilford, who'd come closer to her, asked how it had gone. He wondered if Roger could be trusted. Eliza looked at him intently at his question. In the end, she honestly admitted she didn't know. Walking along the corridor with Wilford, she announced she usually watched those who aroused the most suspicion, but she couldn't say anything for sure about Roger. Wilford asked if that was really true. He was sure if Eliza had taken up the matter, everything would soon be resolved. She expressed hope for this, then smiled, admitting she couldn't even imagine Roger wouldn't even flinch, having encountered her enchanting gaze twice. She considered he would have given in to this.